She asked for a replacement role. She got humiliation instead. The first-class cabin smelled faintly of coffee and recycled air. Folding trays, linen napkins, polite smiles, an atmosphere designed to smooth edges, not expose them. A teenage girl, alone in an aisle seat a few rows behind the partition, raised a trembling hand. Her tray held a dinner roll with a thin, dark line along the crust. She pointed it out quietly to the flight attendant who had just passed, and the attendant, Grace Halford, leaned over with an expression that had been practiced for years, efficiency softened into mock warmth. "Sorry about that," Grace said, but the apology was already wearing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'll bring you another right away." Isla answered in a voice low with embarrassment. She had albinism. Her hair was a pale, soft halo, her features unshadowed, her eyelashes delicate. Nothing about her asked for attention. She only wanted a fresh roll and to feel ordinary for the remainder of a transatlantic flight. "You should be careful with what you touch," Grace added, loud enough for the near rows to hear. Her tone felt small, a needle threaded with a social needlepoint people use to joke away their discomfort in public. "Some of us don't have immune systems of paper towels, you know." The words skated over the cabin like a stone across water. A whisper shivered down the aisle. Eyes that had been looking at magazines or out the window shifted, uncomfortable. The girl's face went still. There was nothing theatrical in her hurt, only a stunned tightening at the throat that made her fingers grip the edge of the tray. She looked down as if the plane itself might swallow her smallness. In the first-class row, Dr. Liana Mercer watched without making a sound. She had been in that seat by choice, a modest privacy, a woman whose work did not permit unnecessary spectacle, who had taught donors the language of dignity and chosen to keep aspects of her private life tightly guarded. She watched the exchange the way she watched protests and grant negotiations, observing, measuring, looking for consequence. Liana's look was not a flare of outrage. It was the cool assessment of someone who had made a profession out of restoring dignity to others. She had learned over 20 years of running a nonprofit that placed educators in underfunded schools how quickly a small slight could echo into a life. She saw it in the girl's hands. She saw it in the way other passengers blinked as if the problem were not theirs to solve. Beyond Liana, a young man with a camera lens cropped into his phone, Marcus Walsh, shifted forward a little. He'd captured better angles of city architecture than apprehensions. Recording strangers was not a habit for him, but certain moments begged to be seen as they were. He raised his phone hesitantly and focused on the exchange, not out of malice, but because a clip might later speak louder than the thin, polite denials people give in the moment. "Is there a problem?" Captain Harris's voice came down the aisle like a formal bell. He had been walking toward the lavatory when he saw the set of faces, the broken rhythm. The captain's presence changed the cabin's gravity. Harris had been an airline man for 30 years and carried with him a belief that small injuries, left unhealed, became catastrophic. Grace straightened. Her apology then was swift, procedural. "I'm sorry, ma'am. It won't happen again." "I believe her complaint should be taken seriously," the captain said, eyes on the girl. "We will replace the meal and make sure she is comfortable. I apologize on behalf of the airline." The cabin believed that resolution, the neatness of a formal apology and a voucher. It allowed passengers to resume their lives. A closed laptop, a sip of wine, the world reduced back to a plane-sized bubble. Isla nodded, cheeks wet with something the cabin could not easily name. A flight attendant returned with a new roll, as if the exchange had been an error, a problem solved with housekeeping. Grace moved away with the practiced step of someone whose displeasure could be folded and hidden beneath the aisle carpet. After the service lull, a small hush settled around Liana, as if the air itself had realized the scene hadn't ended. She rose gracefully, her bag whispering against the leather armrest, and crossed the few rows to where the girl sat. She didn't announce her name. She didn't make a scene or call reporters. Liana reached down and offered a hand that was steady and warm. "Are you all right?" she asked. Isla's eyes lifted, and for the first time she looked at Liana without an island of embarrassment between them. There was a recognition there that had nothing to do with celebrity. Liana's face was not a billboard. But if Liana had been a stranger, the question would have been answered the same way, with gratitude too fragile to speak. Isla began, and then stopped. Her hands twisted in the napkin as if to hide themselves. "Yes, thank you." Liana lowered her voice.
It carried the same steady cadence she used when talking to a board or a classroom. Clear, slightly low, unmoorings kept at bay. "You're not alone. That should never have happened." Isla nodded, and for a second the name hovered between them like a private photograph. Liana didn't introduce herself. She didn't have to. The motion was intimate and small. A light hand on the girl's shoulder. The offer to walk her to the restroom. The assurance that she would not be left alone if she felt unsettled. To anyone watching, it was simply an adult being kind to a teen. Marcus moved forward as the plane descended, his clip already tucked into his phone.
He approached Liana on impulse, the way a passerby might approach a familiar public figure with a question that had nothing to do with fame. "Do you want the raw footage?" he asked, cautious, as if crossing a private threshold. Liana took the phone and watched the 3-minute loop back. Marcus's clip began before the role was mentioned and ended after the captain's apology. It showed everything, including the small details that a viral edit could cut away. The captain's intervention, the girl's lowered gaze, Liana's quiet presence. It was a short truth, unembellished. "Thank you," Liana said. She smiled at Marcus, with the kind of thank you that trusted one human to another. "I won't post this." She didn't want spectacle. She did not want to page through public embarrassment like an exhibit. Her daughter, Isla, had already endured enough. For reasons Liana had always kept private, she had chosen to keep her family life tightly sealed. In the circles Liana moved through, raising policy and asking donors for moments of vulnerability was a different thing than exposing a child's private life to the public. On the jet bridge, Grace Halford typed a report into the airline's portal. Her fingers moved with the assurance of a person who had learned the language of procedure to justify a feeling. How often that had worked. She wrote a terse account that flattened nuance into administrative action. Passenger became aggressive, attendant felt threatened. Her message contained no slurs, no explicit mention of the girl's appearance. It relied instead on a formula that would soon prove effective in another era, implication, backed up by the certainty of a written record. By the time Liana, Isla, and Marcus stepped into the terminal, the world had not yet turned. There were few cameras, fewer headlines. The city's noise swallowed the small episode like a stone into river water. Liana folded herself into being a mother first. Quiet, careful, walking Isla to the car as if the evening were nothing extraordinary. Back at home, an apartment with books, plants, and a photograph of Liana in front of a school, chalk dust in her hair, Liana checked her phone. A message from Evelyn Rhodes, the chair of Liana's board, blinked mild and small. Saw a clip circulating. "Are you okay?" Liana breathed, and the thin confidence that had been a hedge all her life settled into place. She typed back with the economy of someone who needed to control the rhythm, not the content. "I am. It's been handled, thank you." She did not tell Evelyn or anyone else that Grace had filed a report. She wanted to see how the airline processed it, uninterested in turning every minor administrative move into a headline. She wanted to protect Isla's privacy in the small, stubborn way a parent protects a child from the glare of curiosity. The first public edit arrived about 12 hours later. It was not malicious in a Hollywood sense. No dramatic score, no montage. It was a 10-second clip cropped tight, showing Liana standing up in the cabin while the girls sat, then cutting mid-apology with a headline that read, "CEO throws temper on flight." The crop omitted the captain's intervention, the captain's apology, and the attendant's initial words. What it presented, in its narrow focus, was an image of a woman in a business suit rising in an airplane as if to admonish a lowly passenger. The editing technique was faceless and efficient, the right frames, the right cut, the right caption. Within an hour, the cropped clip had been reshared by accounts with thousands of followers. Someone added a comment implying a pattern, a CEO who used power to silence ordinary people. Someone else attached a screenshot claiming a threatening message had been sent to the attendant. The chorus needed only volume. The absence of context could be made a virtue. Liana watched the clip and felt the tightness of someone who had been trained to look at reputations like fragile ecosystems. One misapplied narrative could starve an entire institution. Her nonprofit, Beacon Horizons, worked in small towns and big cities, putting books and teachers where budgets feared to tread. It lived on trust. Now, a 10-second cut sought to rewrite not only an evening in a plane, but the entire ledger of a career. Evelyn called again. This time her voice trembled around professional concern. "Some of our donors are asking questions. Nothing confirmed yet, but there are already queries from the foundation. We should meet." Liana closed her eyes, hearing not the tremor of panic but the precise clang of consequence. She agreed to a board call for the next morning, and privately requested the raw footage Marcus had given her. She wanted to control one variable, facts she could verify. By morning, the small bowl of coal, a smear, had become an ember. The edited clip had spun into a brighter headline on one of the national feeds, lifted by an account that labeled it, "What Privilege Looks Like." Donors pinged, staff looked to Liana's email with the furtive hunger of people who depended on a leader for answers. The nonprofit's inbox filled with messages from strangers proclaiming the old certainty. People are what they seem in the clip. In orbit around that social media flurry,
Grace's internal report sat in a file cabinet like a match. She had written her version with a clear hand and sent it to an email address that fed the airline's staff admin inbox. The report characterized the encounter as destabilizing, and in the airline's lifetime of reports, such incidents were not extraordinary. Airline compliance teams were trained to investigate. A few sentences in a staff report could, over time, accrue meaning. In Liana's office the next morning, the board convened in a thrumming silence. Evelyn Rhodes, as composed as ever, presided.
The staff prepared a statement that balanced empathy with firmness, but the conversation was always a second act to the public narrative. "We need to be transparent," Evelyn said. "We will acknowledge the footage, but we must include the context. Have we obtained the unedited video?" "Yes," Liana answered. Marcus's footage plus the internal cameras could show every necessary frame. She had ordered a secured copy sent to an encrypted drive. "We should prepare a release," said a young communications director, voice taut. "If donors see only the cropped clip, they'll assume the worst. We need to get the unedited footage out." Liana listened and felt the subtle pressure of a board that wore its fiduciary duty like armor. Their concerns were not mean, they were practical. The nonprofit could not long function under a cloud of doubt. Then came an email from a donor whose grants represented a significant slice of Beacon's operating budget. The message was polite but precise. "We are monitoring your response. Please keep us updated. In the interim, we are placing a temporary hold on discretionary funds." It was a needle. The effects of such holds were not instant, but they fed into a rhythm that could slow programs, delay salaries, and fracture trust among staff. Liana explained the facts as she knew them: the full footage, the captain's apology, the initial assault by coincidence. The board called for a press release, for a timeline, for a legal consult. Liana agreed. And then someone else did something Liana hadn't expected. A headline, this time attached to a handle that trafficked specifically in outrages, claimed Liana had been reported for aggression. It paired Grace's name with an anonymous quote from a source inside the airline's compliance office. There was no link, there was no document. There was enough insinuation to give the narrative teeth. Liana felt the old gnawing calibration of a public figure under assault. This was not simply about one woman's feeling affronted on a plane. What annoyed Liana most was the way stories now moved, not like a stream but like a centrifuge. A small, talented cut could be amplified by paid accounts and automated resharing. Whoever wanted to can fabricate the cadence of outrage. She called Marcus and asked him to keep his footage offline for now. "We will use it when it can no longer be denied," she told him, and he understood the quiet strategy. He was earnest and restless in the way of people who believed in truth as action, not event. "You must trust me," she said, voice even. He trusted her. But trust does not plug a leak in perception. The damage a smearing does to a donation ledger is not always about facts. It is about the cascade that begins when someone with money decides the benefit of association is no longer worth the risk. In a world where reputation functioned like currency, a small edit could bankrupt goodwill.
That afternoon, a staffer forwarded a photograph of a printed copy of Grace's report. The report, as any formal document did, carried a timestamp, the night of the flight, 22:34. Its language implied escalation, an interaction that made the attendant feel threatened, and suggested Liana had been confrontational. It contained no mention of the captain's intervention. It had been filed before the airline's review team had viewed the cockpit camera and before they had collected Marcus's raw footage. It was a public record, hidden as an internal note. Once the clip had been released online, the report picked up the air of corroboration. Liana sat with the printout, the air pressure of momentary panic changing her metabolism in minor ways: thinner breath, a constriction at the throat. She thought of Isla and the simplicity of the beginning, a request for a replacement role. She thought of the way small, private humiliations could be levered into public judgment. A text came from an unknown number at 9:12 p.m. "We can help make this go away for a fee." No company name, no official letterhead, just the sort of solicitation that had begun appearing in recent years. People who specialize in reputation were quietly offered contracts to shape conversation. Liana recognized the style from friends in philanthropy. Such offers were part of the modern world. She forwarded the text to Evelyn with one word: ignore. Evelyn responded quickly, a string of expletives that revealed more human feeling than the board chair's public face ever did. "Do not interact," she typed. "This is exactly what we feared." As the night widened, Liana sat in half-light and thought through options. Her instinct was to preserve Isla's privacy and to hold the raw footage until it could be shared in a way that preserved dignity. But the world outside used speed as a weapon. The cropped clip had already lodged in enough minds to provoke consequences. Donors wanted certainty. The board wanted assurance. The staff, all of them, the teachers, the coordinators, needed to know Beacon would not be run into the ground by a 15-second lie.
She closed the blinds and put her phone aside for an hour, trying to resist the reflex of watching the mentions count upward into thousands. She engineered a simple plan: gather the unedited footage, secure copies with 2 independent witnesses, prepare a factual timeline, and draft a short statement emphasizing that they would release context at the proper time. Legal would review, the board would review. She would not make a spectacle out of her daughter's distress. When Liana finally looked again, a new headline had already landed. Exclusive: CEO of nonprofit accused of intimidating passenger, sources say. It quoted anonymous accounts, and in a small italicized note, included a screen grab of Grace's report with a redacted badge number. The copy implied that the report somehow justified the narrative.
The piece was not false. It was simply arranged to suggest a story that could not be immediately disproven. Liana felt something shift then beyond her immediate fear. This was no longer an act of gracelessness by a flight attendant. It had acquired machinery, anonymous sources, packaged quotes, and the willingness of strangers to presume the worst. The matter, she realized, had been allowed to outgrow its premises. Outside her inbox, a quiet thing that would become crucial had begun. A comment thread pointed to a Twitter account, Apex Digital Solutions Official, claiming to do reputation management. Whether it was directly involved or merely opportunistic, the name geminated across feeds. Apex Digital Solutions was a plausible-sounding corporate moniker. In the age of outsourced outrage and paid narratives, such firms were the new middlemen.
The weight of the institutional machine, press releases, board meetings, legal counsel, pressed at Liana, while back at home, Isla guarded the kitchen table like a small island. Why did she say that? Isla asked late one night, voice small across the table. She spoke of the attendant, of the glare, of being looked at as if she were different. She did not ask about Liana's work or about the fundraising lifeblood. She only wanted to understand what it meant to be dismissed. Liana answered in pieces she thought her daughter needed. Some people say things to make themselves feel better. Some people are careless. That doesn't mean you are anything but yourself. But privately, Liana also felt the faster currents under the surface. Smears rarely arrived alone. They were often accompanied, or followed, by administrative consequences the smear set in motion. Internal reports, frozen accounts, and the quiet willingness of institutions to distance themselves from anything that might bruise them. When the board convened a special call, Evelyn spoke plainly. "We have to assume this will be magnified," she said. "Our priority must be the staff, the programs, and ensuring our operations remain uninterrupted." They argued briefly about whether to release the full, unedited footage. Some feared it would feed the appetite of partisans who would clip and recut with malign intent. Others argued that transparency would demonstrate the truth and drown the cropped lie with context. The vote was careful. Prepare the footage, secure it, and only release it through a controlled forum once legal had cleared it. Liana had hardly expected to find herself in the position of deciding whether to make private pain public. She had always believed that revelation should serve the dignity of people, not feed curiosity. Still, she was not naive. She understood that a private choice to protect her daughter's identity had made the scene more vulnerable. Absence of a publicly known family tie created space for narrative entrepreneurs to invent motives. Once, on quieter evenings, she would have imagined the problem as a line on an email, something to manage. Now it felt like an entire machine assembling itself around a single false premise. She prepared for a press conference that morning like a surgeon preparing for a necessary but risky operation, methodically. She would not give interviews to opportunistic hosts. She would present the footage at a live stream with timestamps, with witnesses, with the captain's full statement. She wanted to name the vehicle of the lie without becoming a vehicle herself for drama. Before she could act, something else shifted the plane of the day. A low, formal notification arrived from an unfamiliar law firm. It was short and professional. The airline's compliance team had been engaged by the firm to perform an internal review.
Several items would be requested: device access, email logs, and any communications between Liana and airline staff. Liana's secretary flagged the note with the word indefinito, where specifics were missing. Who exactly had requested the review, and under what authority? The line between internal complaint and external investigation was vague enough to be dangerous. Liana felt the hands of procedure begin to close like a paper flower pressed between pages. She called her attorney and asked what to expect. Her attorney's answer was careful and familiar. Compliance requests were not the same as criminal charges, but their presence could create the public image of investigation. The mere existence of requests could be amplified into headlines. "They can seize devices?" Liana asked. "Possibly," the attorney said. "If an agency gets involved, yes. But right now, it's primarily an internal inquiry. We can work with the airline's counsel to ensure proper channels." The word possibly was enough to wake a deeper fear. The timing of the report, filed that night, a cropped clip posted within hours, suggested coordination beyond a single attendant's impulse. Who had the motive to escalate a small private humiliation into a reputational fire?
Liana's mind mapped the institutional grid: donors, board, staff, the local press, the network of reputation consultants. The pattern fit a familiar story: someone with resources who sought to leverage a private moment into public advantage. She thought of enemies she had made in the field: a corporation that had lost a contract when Beacon refused to work on terms that would have privatized a school program, a vendor that had failed to win a grant because Liana had insisted on accountability. She did not leap to accusation. She catalogued the possibilities. Late into the evening, a new ping hit her inbox: a screenshot of an invoice with a company name she'd seen before: Apex Digital Solutions, an invoice for social amplification. The invoice was indefinito in its payer line. It bore no signature. If authentic, it meant someone had budgeted for a campaign. But single documents, unverified, could not be the whole story. Liana chose what she always chose: method. She would not let conjecture drive action. She ordered two things simultaneously: secure copies of all video and the beginning of an audit into the social accounts amplifying the clip. She was, in her bones, a person who believed in evidence. Evidence could be slow. It could also be unstoppable. The first block of her plan required allies. She called Maya and asked for help with public framing. She called Marcus and told him he should not post the footage. She sent a quiet note to David Park, an alumnus of Beacon who had once taught cybersecurity and now consulted quietly for nonprofits, asking if he might take a look at the birth of the online storm. David agreed immediately.
He had a steady mind and a gift for tracing digital breadcrumbs that most people mistook for mere luck. "Don't let them pause funds without proof," Liana told Evelyn in a soft conference call. "We will provide evidence. We will show context. But we must also be practical. Pace our releases so they are undeniable and not a reaction to every smear." Evelyn's answer was a small, brittle laugh. "You always make battles into method, Liana. That's why we believe in you." That night, Liana sat at the kitchen table with Isla across from her. "Are you scared?" she asked. Isla shrugged, a small, brave gesture. "Of course." She tapped her phone and then hid it as if the screen were a private contraband. People said things. Some of the comments were about me. Liana chose a different kind of honesty. "You are not defined by their words," she said. "There will be people who want to weaponize you because it's easy, but there are also people who will defend you with facts and with their own lives." Isla nodded. "Will they know you're my mom?" Liana hesitated. She had been careful for years to keep the family out of headshots and fundraising letters. Protecting her daughter from headline glare had been deliberate. Now the world had forced that privacy into a question. "Not everyone will," she said. "Not yet, but when the time comes to be public, we will choose the shape of that truth." What Liana could not foresee was how quickly a private shape could become public pressure. Within 2 days, a new article arrived at the newsroom desk with a header that implied ongoing investigations. It used Grace's report as one supporting artifact and the cropped clip as its visual. The piece was careful to call the airline for comment, which the airline provided. An internal review had been opened. It then quoted anonymous donors who said they were closely watching developments. That phrase, closely watching, had the weight of a dirge. The nonprofit's phone started to ring off the hook. Staff who had never weathered a public storm before froze on the other end, trying to balance compassion with direct work. Liana walked the office like someone tending a small animal who had been stunned by a sudden noise. Patience, warmth, orderly care. She controlled what she could. She had to. Beacon's teachers needed payroll. The after-school program needed supplies. Liana's calm, though, was not the absence of fear. It was the quiet insistence that the next moves be deliberate. She convened a small war room. 2 trusted staff members, Evelyn, Maya, Marcus, and David. They met at a table littered with laptops, printouts, and a single whiteboard that soon filled with timelines. Marcus supplied raw footage time-coded. Maya annotated the social posts with timestamps and amplification rates. David began tracing the accounts that had led the trending wave. "Look at this," David said, and his voice sharpened. He had a way of speaking when a pattern resolved.
"These aren't individual reactions. The repost spikes at regular intervals, and several of the first amplifiers are accounts we've seen before, accounts that coordinate to simulate organic outrage." He pulled up a graph. The immediate reaction peaked within an hour, faded a bit, then spiked again at precise engineered intervals. Someone was not simply sharing organic indignation. Someone was, with resources, pushing narrative cadence. They did not yet have a smoking gun. Evidence had to be built carefully: a chain of purchases, an invoice, a bank transfer, an email trail. But the patterns on the graph were a starting place. They represented the possibility of orchestration, of a deliberate amplification designed to create the illusion of consensus. Liana listened and thought of the thin margin between truth and perception. She had taught her staff to value both truth and the narrative that made truth visible. Now she would have to marshal both. As the meeting stretched into the night, Liana caught a thought that both calmed and sharpened her. The attack had not been against her only as a leader. It had been against Isla as a person. The gendered, racialized, physical dynamics of the humiliation were not incidental. They were the exact type of pattern Beacon had long sought to dismantle. This was now personal, but it was also emblematic of the work she had been doing for years. That made it more dangerous, and also more moral. Still, the immediate risk remained: donors freezing funds, staff with wavering focus, and the possibility that an internal airline report, filed with the right tone, could be seized upon as institutional corroboration. Liana wrote the night's notes in a careful hand. They would begin with the simplest demands: secure all footage, catalog every social post, preserve all internal records from the airline, and begin a quiet outreach to donors to reassure them of transparency. She rose, tired in the way that meant she had given the night everything she had. Isla slept, the apartment quiet save for the city hum. Liana checked her phone one last time and saw a brief notification she hadn't expected, a direct message to an account she controlled from an anonymous handle that read, simply, "We can make your problem go away. Send payment." She didn't reply. She photographed the message and sent it with a note to David and to the lawyer. It was another small arrow in the quiver of evidence they would need. It might or might not be connected to the larger pattern. Any one piece could not convict. But the accumulation of pieces, timestamps, raw footage, coordinated accounts, invoices, was beginning to form a chain. Outside, the city slept, and the world of headlines continued to turn. Inside Beacon's small war room, a plan began to take shape: to weather the first storm, to mount an evidence-based counter, and to preserve the safest thing of all, the dignity of a girl who had simply asked for a replacement role.
They had not yet won anything. They had, however, begun to collect the things that might ensure they could tell the story as it had happened, and in a world of edits and half-truths, method could be the only weapon that mattered. When Liana switched off the lamp, Isla moved in the sleep of someone on whom too many eyes had rested. Liana sat for a moment in the dark, thinking of how small a humiliation could become a long fight. She felt, as always, the old responsibility: to teach her child how to stand, quietly but fully, in a world that frequently asked otherwise. Morning would bring more messages, more questions, and perhaps the first formalities of an investigation. For now, there was the small domestic rhythm: a bowl of oatmeal, a check of the mailbox, an email from a donor with the subject line, indefinito, that would not be marked down as either supportive or condemnatory until the facts were known. Outside the window, a courier clipped past carrying packages for a world that assumed reputation was a commodity. Inside, Liana and a handful of allies would begin to assemble a different kind of capital: proof, human witness, and the patient mechanics of verification. None of it was glamorous. None of it would come with the instant delight of viral applause, but it would be real. Before the first board call of the morning, Liana paused at the door and looked at Isla, still asleep, then at the pile of printouts on the kitchen table. She took a breath and placed both hands on the evidence binder Marcus had left. She felt the weight of it, the promise of a strategy that refused to let an edited 10-second clip. They started the live stream the way Liana had always preferred to begin hard conversations, with facts laid out like stepping stones, each one close enough to touch, none so far away that someone might fall between them. The war room hummed behind the camera, Maya at the console, David with a stack of printouts, Marcus adjusting the angle of the unedited clip so the audience could see everything at once. Evelyn framed the table, a steady presence who had moved from boardroom to crisis room without losing composure. Liana sat beside Isla. For the first time since the flight, they would be visible together on purpose. It was a decision Liana had not made lightly. There were risks, old habits of protection, the impulse to shield a child from public glare. But the smear had escalated precisely because their privacy had been an absence that others filled with lies. If the truth could be shown at their own pace, with dignity, then the moment of revelation would be theirs to shape. Maya gave Liana a quick nod. "When you're ready," she said. Liana's voice was steady when she spoke into the camera. She did not use the language of spectacle. She used the language of documentation. "Good afternoon. I'm Liana Risser. This is my daughter Isla."
We are here because an edited clip and a set of manufactured documents have been used to portray a night inaccurately and to attack my work and our organization. She set the original raw clip on the screen and let it play.
The feed showed the cabin in its full context, the role, the exchange, Captain Harris stepping into frame, his apology to Isla, Liana's quiet walk to the girl, the attendant's retreat. Marcus's original file carried metadata along its edge, the camera's timestamp, an embedded GPS stamp confirming the flight path, a device tag that matched the one Marcus had given them. The forensic overlay David had prepared highlighted those elements without jargon. It read like a trail of light. Unedited footage, timestamp 22/12/34, camera ID MW041, GPS lat long, cockpit confirmation 22/13/01. Liana did not shout the truth. She let the video speak. When it finished, she said, "That is how it happened." She then presented the first layer of documentary evidence, Captain Harris's written statement stamped and signed in the airline's internal system, the service report that documented the replacement meal, and the attendant's initial log, which recorded the exchange without escalation. She did not denounce Grace. She asked for facts. She asked the public to judge according to them. Maya, off camera, walked through the timeline they'd compiled. She showed in simple on-screen graphics how the cropped 10-second clip had been stitched into a narrative and then amplified through accounts that spiked at regular intervals. She displayed a chart that David had made, repost per minute, with the first cluster igniting within 45 minutes of the flight footage being cropped and uploaded. Then she showed the invoices they'd found, screenshots of transfers from a shell account labeled Granite Holdings into Apex Digital Solutions, labeled Social Amplification Q1. Apex Digital Solutions appears in multiple public records as a reputation management company, Maya explained. They have been hired by clients to amplify narratives online. That alone isn't a crime. What we have found are invoices and communications that suggest a deeper coordination. Our reporting shows payments from accounts tied to Sentinel Technologies, a company that had been in contact with Beacon Horizons prior to a rejected contract. We reached out for comment. Sentinel's representative declined to comment. The on-screen invoices were prosaic. Dates, line items, social reach, influencer seeding, bot amplification listed as a vague consultancy service in one of the early documents. The language was deliberately bland. The meaning was not. Beneath the images, David had annotated account numbers and payment traces, bank routing references that when followed went to a corporate bank in another state, and then to a smaller transfer passed through an intermediary, a classic layering.
Follow the money, someone in Liana's office had once said in a different context, and now it was the connective tissue that would make a riot of disparate things cohere. The chain was not a cinematic direct line from a named executive to the tweet. It was instead a braided rope made of invoices, client codes, and personnel emails. The rope could be followed. David stepped forward to explain the cyber angle without descending into technical spectacle. He showed a forensic report that described an intrusion into Beacon Horizons' server environment, a series of authenticated attempts to access internal files, some successful, some not, timestamped attempts at 3:17 a.m., 3:23 a.m., and 3:41 a.m., the night after the clip circulated. The forensics team had recovered prior iterations of the nonprofit's financial records from a secure off-site backup. The restored files showed no sign of the alleged irregularities that had been presented online as evidence of wrongdoing. The version that had been shown publicly was altered. It appears the attackers created fabricated financial documents and then uploaded them to Beacon's public portal, David said. They also planted them in a way that made it look like they were internal. The malware used here was not sophisticated in an operational sense. Its purpose was plausibly deniable, to overwrite and to insert a narrative. He pointed to a cluster of IP addresses used to access Beacon's environment. One lead went to a virtual private server leased under the name Granite Holdings. Granite's registration was intentionally opaque, but another link, an invoice cross-reference, connected Granite to a consulting contract paid for by an account that had been flagged in documents between Sentinel's procurement office and Apex. Maya displayed an email thread they'd obtained through other means, an exchange between a procurement manager at Sentinel and a representative at Apex. The thread's subject line, blandly labeled Outreach Campaign, concealed a conversational tone that grew pointed as the thread progressed. "We need to neutralize her influence," one line read, the pronoun unmistakable. A reply from Apex's account included a schedule and a budget. Phase 1, viral seeding. Phase 2, reputation management. Phase 3, content pressure. The email headers included timestamps and routing information. The authenticity of the thread had been vetted by independent forensic review. Liana watched the screen with Isla at her side. She did not flinch when the phrase "neutralize her influence" appeared. The words had the coldness of corporate language. Their aim was human damage. "They were trying not just to humiliate my daughter," Liana said softly. "They were trying to take the work away from thousands of people who depend on it." On the other side of the table, Tanya Rodriguez listened to the live stream with her hands folded.
The district attorney had come into the room earlier that day after a private call with Evelyn. She had arrived not as an investigator wielding a warrant, but as someone who understood the civic harm in weaponized narratives. "I want to make clear what a prosecutor can and cannot do," Tanya said into the camera when asked a question.
What has been presented here will be evaluated by law enforcement. If there is sufficient probable cause to show a conspiracy to defraud, and there are elements that point in that direction, then there will be legal follow-up. That process is ongoing. We have already opened an inquiry into the potential criminal elements involved in the falsification of records and unauthorized access to systems. Her words had the effect of a hinge, firm without over-promising. It signaled that the public display would not be an end, but a supplement to the work of investigators. The live stream was methodical because the case demanded it. Marcus's unedited video, the captain's statement, the internal reports, the invoice screenshots, David's network traces, and the restoration of the unaltered financial records were not presented like trophies. They were presented like evidence, time-stamped, cross-referenced, repeatedly authenticated. When a viewer asked a question in the chat about the identity of the shell companies, David answered without naming methods that could teach wrongdoing. He explained the conventions investigators used to follow payments and the role auditors played in verifying a paper trail. For a long hour, the country watched. The initial viral clip that had once been captioned with outraged assumptions became a footnote beneath a fuller narrative. The cropped 10-second image could still be used by those who wished to, but the unedited context sat in a stable place, archived, time-stamped, and easy to access for anyone who cared to read the ledger of fact. Then came the moment the network couldn't have easily erased. An auditor from the bank handling the Granite transfers testified live to a recorded statement that confirmed a sequence of transfers leading to Apex. The auditor's qualification was precise. Transfers made from a corporate client with ties to Sentinel's procurement records, routed through intermediary accounts commonly used in third-party purchasing. It was the kind of bureaucratic sentence that, in its specificity, cut through 1,000 insinuations. Once the livestream concluded, the story's momentum forced reaction. Sentinel Technologies released a brief, carefully worded statement that said it had engaged third-party consultants to monitor public sentiment and that it categorically denied authorizing illegal activity. Apex Digital Solutions' public-facing account issued a denial that was equally spare. The denials looked practiced. The evidence the team had presented had now forced the denials to be specific in their vagueness.
Within 24 hours, a small flurry of tangible consequences followed. A search warrant authorized by a judge, based on the inquiry opened by Tanya's office, allowed investigators to seize servers and records from a data center affiliated with Apex. Law enforcement served the offices of Granite Holdings and of a shell company that had managed payments. Routine corporate filings showed changes in directorships at a few uncertain addresses. Some of those names matched email headers the team had already traced. Then, the more personal administrative consequences landed on Beacon. The federal agency that had been alerted about the apparent tampering put a temporary hold on some systems as they examined the forensic data. An independent auditor, working at the request of a foundation that had paused funding, confirmed that the version of Beacon's financials posted during the smear was fabricated. The foundation released a statement returning funds in the short term and pledging to await the results of the inquiry, but it also issued a pointed promise to reassess procurement vetting to avoid similar manipulations in the future. Through it all, Liana remained present and collected. There were days when she would find herself sitting by the kitchen table with the weight of temporality pressing in, staff who needed salaries, vendors waiting on invoices, teachers asking if the after-school program would run. The practical urgencies never left. They were the real stakes. There was a harder hour when Beacon's human resources director told Liana that the airline's compliance report had been forwarded to a federal agency. They had been asked to surrender certain devices. The investigators were careful about process. They wanted to make sure everything could be examined. They were not making charges yet, but the optics were bad. Images of evidence being held by authorities fed a perception of guilt. Liana consented to cooperation. She handed over devices on the advice of counsel and in the knowledge that transparency would not be punished. It was a hard moment, handing over the phone containing private messages between mother and child, giving investigators access to calendars that held the names of donors and the school visits that underwrote Beacon's work. It felt like exposure by necessity. But there was one procedural shelter the team had prepared. The war room had insisted on redundant archives, multiple independent witnesses to the raw footage, and off-site backups of every file. Those redundancies were practical armor against complacent authorities who might be tempted to treat seized material as a statement without context. The low point arrived like a physical ache. A morning brought an internal letter from the board, an interim leave, pending investigation, recommended for the CEO to avoid conflict while inquiries continued. It was legalese meant to be neutral. For Liana, it felt like being suspended from the life she had built.
Evelyn's voice, on the call that delivered the news, was gentle and taut. "We are doing this to protect the organization," she said. "I know it feels like betrayal. It is not." Liana did not fight the leave publicly. She accepted the board's decision quietly. She had planned for the possibility. But the emotional weight of seeing her office emptied, of stepping back while the organization's phone still rang, was a pressure that moved in slow, harsh pulses. Isla watched without the ability to change the tides. She listened to her mother offer practical instructions on how to reassure staff, how to keep payroll moving, how to tend to donors personally if asked. Isla's resilience was a quiet thing that steadied Liana. "We will get this back," Isla said once, her teenage voice small but steady. "People know you. People know Beacon." That faith was the kind that sustained the long, boring work of evidence collection. It was not triumphalist, it was faithful. With Liana officially on leave, the public defense needed to be anchored in others' voices. Maya published the first long-form piece, a careful, sourced account that outlined the chain of events, the edits, the invoices, the IP traces. It did not make claims about the motives of executives at Sentinel. It reported instead what the documentation showed and what independent auditors had verified. The piece named Apex and Granite Holdings as operational nodes in the campaign and quoted an expert on disinformation describing the typical anatomy of an orchestrated smear. The piece included an interview with Captain Harris, who repeated his account in a calm, official voice. Maya's piece had consequences. It prompted other journalists to dig. One outlet began asking pointed questions about a procurement timeline between Sentinel and a vendor whose contract had been in dispute with Beacon. Another outlet obtained a recorded voicemail left by an intermediary at Apex, asking Grace to formalize her report to establish an administrative trace. The voicemail's timestamp matched the night the internal report had been filed. Grace herself became a subject of scrutiny. She had written the report out of a genuine perception of being threatened, she said in an internal interview. She had filed the account with the composure of someone following procedure, but the voicemail suggested she had been nudged to fill in a narrative that would later be useful to amplification. It was unclear whether she understood the larger campaign. Her explanation was not a vindication nor a confession. It was the confused reply of someone caught inside a system whose shape she did not control. Investigators, meanwhile, pursued the money. The bank traces were a map that, when followed, led from Granite to Apex and then to corporate transfers that touched a Sentinel procurement account. A subpoena produced emails in which a mid-level procurement manager at Sentinel had discussed cleaning up PR.
The language was defensive, bordering on perfunctory, but the internal tone suggested an awareness that some reputational work might be necessary. An executive at Sentinel, whose signature appeared on several procurement documents, Richard Bennett, resigned suddenly. Sentinel's public statements said the resignation was for personal reasons. The company also announced an internal review of procurement practices. The timing of the resignation, the context of the invoices, and the public pressure created a swirl that felt decisive, even if it was messy. Apex's offices were raided. Authorities detained a handful of contractors who ran coordinated posting networks. Their arrest was reported with the kind of legal caveat that was necessary in any responsible reporting: allegations pending, investigations ongoing. The lead contractor, whose name appeared on invoices and internal correspondence, was taken into custody on suspicion of running a network that sold coordinated amplification as a service. His company had been a known player in the murky corners of digital reputation. The arc of accountability was not theatrical. Not every name linked to the scheme was indicted on the spot. Some people resigned, others were suspended. Some operations were shuttered while investigations took their course. The slow machinery of justice had begun to turn. The public narrative, which had once favored a cropped clip, now had to contend with documented evidence of orchestration. Through it all, Beacon's staff held on. Evelyn's steadiness continued to be a force. She negotiated emergency grants, stewarded donor calls, and managed the day-to-day with a practical tenderness that kept programs afloat. Teachers scheduled classes, coordinators checked in on students, and Liana, even on leave, continued to respond to urgent matters with the kind of decisiveness that had defined her career. The turning point publicly arrived on a morning when Maya and David organized a live forensic demonstration for a congressional committee investigating corporate misuse of reputation technologies. David walked the committee through the evidence, the cropped clip and the unedited footage, the invoices, the bank transfers, the server logs. He demonstrated in straightforward language how coordinated amplification had been purchased and how fabricated files had been planted. He did not give a playbook for wrongdoing. He explained patterns and chain of custody. Committee members listened and asked sharp questions. They asked about corporate responsibility, procurement oversight, and the role of third-party consultants who could weaponize narratives. Their questions suggested legislative appetite for reform,
stronger transparency around paid amplification, clearer rules for procurement and accountability when a vendor's work produces targeted harm.
After the hearing, a cascade of op-eds and expert commentaries asked the same question. How could a society whose institutions depended on reputation guard against industrialized defamation? The conversation that Beacon had never sought to start nevertheless became public policy fodder, and Liana, quietly at first, then more visibly, found herself asked to testify. She accepted. She would not ask for pity. She asked for guardrails. On the day she returned to Beacon's offices, it was not to reclaim a throne. She walked into a staff meeting that felt less like a courtroom and more like a classroom. She spoke about priorities: protect the staff, repair the systems, listen to the people served. She did not spend long on the past. She spent her time on what came next. The nonprofit's donors returned in full measure because the case had become a cautionary tale that donors wanted to remedy rather than be associated with. Foundations offered bridge grants to cover the donation gaps while Beacon updated its cybersecurity and underwent an independent audit. A coalition of organizations that had themselves been targets of coordinated campaigns reached out with offers of mutual aid, legal consultations, and technical support. The solidarity that had sustained Beacon was not a miracle. It was the predictable product of relationships built over decades. As the months that followed unspooled, a few legal outcomes clarified some of the arc. Apex's lead operator pleaded to charges related to running a coordinated network that sold amplification and to participating in falsifying records. Others took civil settlements. Sentinel's procurement manager faced internal discipline, and the company implemented new procurement policies. Grace Halford, the attendant whose initial humiliation of Isla had set the episode in motion, faced an employment review. Her report to the airline remained an administrative fact, but the voicemail and the context showed that her report had been amplified beyond what it alone could have produced. The airline offered her a pathway to counseling and training. It did not publicly brand her a villain. The story had moved beyond individual malice to show a system that could be exploited. There were hearings and resignations of executives at smaller firms implicated in the scheme. There were civil suits and settlements. The legal chapter did not have a single tidy ending, which in many ways felt more truthful to Liana and her team. Real life rarely offers cinematic closures. It offers instead a slow settling of effects and a rearrangement of accountability. Across those months, Liana leaned on the things she had always believed in, that durable work was repaired brick by brick, not by a single victorious headline. Beacon's programs resumed their steady cadence. Teachers returned to classrooms.
Grants were relicensed to ensure transparency. They instituted a new policy. Any staff person working with vendors that handled public communications had to follow a vetting process with independent oversight. The board adopted procurement guidelines that required multiple sign-offs for public relations contracts. Those changes were small in bureaucratic form, but large in consequence. Liana made a decision about privacy that was as public as it was private. She began to speak more openly about being a mother whose child lived with albinism. She described in gentle terms what it meant to protect a child in public spaces, and how the world's casual cruelties could become organized attack. She did not make her daughter's experience a story for consumption, she made it a reason for policy. Her voice helped shape a national conversation about how visible difference made people targets, and how institutions and corporations should be held to higher standards when their tools of influence harmed individuals. In the quieter hours, the mother-daughter bond deepened. Isla returned to school with a steadier step. She met other students who had seen the live stream. Some had supportive questions, others had thoughtless comments. Liana worked with counselors to support Isla, not as a spectacle, but as a young person processing the world. They took long walks in the park, drank too sweet coffee at a diner, and attended a Beacon event where a class of children presented cards they'd made. Isla stood at the back, small and composed, watching the room that had been part of her mother's life bloom again. At a town hall meeting a few months after the initial storm, a woman in the audience stood and asked a question that cut to the core. How do ordinary people defend themselves when reputations can be bought and sold? Liana answered as she always had, with a mixture of practical advice and moral clarity. She spoke about the need for documentation, about the value of community, and about the responsibility institutions had to protect the privacy of those they served. She argued for legislation that would make it harder for third-party actors to weaponize anonymity, and she urged foundations to require procurement transparency in grants. The town hall was not viral. It did not need to be. It stitched together local leaders, teachers, and families. It was exactly the kind of thing Liana had built a life to create: infrastructure for integrity. There was a particular day, late in the arc, when the residual public attention had cooled enough that Liana could reflect without the mechanical hum of cameras. She and Isla sat in the window seat of their apartment, the city spread in a grid of small lights below. They had just come from a small Beacon celebration,
alumni who had returned to show support, teachers who had been through cuts and who now had resources to plan lessons for a whole year. Isla doodled in a notebook, her pencil a slow metronome.
"Are you sorry you told people about me?" she asked, not accusing, but curious. Liana considered the domestic question, the ethical cost of exposure versus the civic good of documentation. She had chosen disclosure as a strategy, an act of agency. It had not been necessary for vindication. They might have won without revealing their family. But Liana had wanted to control the context in which a child's identity could be used. By stepping forward, she had shaped the narrative toward dignity. "No," Liana said. "I told people about you because the truth needed to be yours, not someone else's version of you. But I would have kept you private if I could have protected what mattered. This was the path that allowed us to do both, to protect you and to defend the people Beacon serves." Isla folded her paper and leaned her head on Liana's shoulder. "I like our life," she said. "I like that we taught people how to talk to each other." They were not naive. There would always be moments of discomfort. There would always be new ways someone might try to hurt a cause by targeting a person. But there was now a sturdier architecture around Beacon, donors who had seen the evidence and returned, a board that had learned the cost of timidity, a network of partners ready to lend expertise when digital campaigns started to look like storms rather than random gusts. Months after the crisis began, Beacon reopened an after-school program that had been delayed by the smear. Children returned with backpacks, laughter, and homework. A volunteer teacher took the stage at a ceremony and spoke about how the community had rallied. She did not mention the smear by name. She did not have to. The audience understood. The program's restoration was a statement in itself. In a hearing room where a congressional committee discussed the need for clearer rules, Liana testified about what it felt like to have private life become public in a way that weaponized a difference. She did not ask for sympathy. She asked for safeguards, for legal clarity about procurement, for accountability when amplification networks sold outrage to the highest bidder. On the same day, one of the contractors implicated in the scheme was convicted of running coordinated disinformation and falsifying corporate documents. A small press release announced a settlement between Beacon and a vendor who had been used as cover in the campaign. The settlement included a modest financial reparations package, a public apology, and a commitment to fund Beacon's digital safety program. The legalese did not erase the experience, but it created a practical resource that would prevent similar harm to others. Perhaps most importantly, Grace Halford's internal case closed without a dramatic indictment of her person. Her initial words had caused harm. Her filing had been used by others. She had been disciplined and offered remediation. The narrative moved away from casting her as a caricature of cruelty and toward seeing her as someone who had been within systems that incentivized simple administrative fixes over curious compassion. The airline revised its training and reporting protocols in response to public pressure, emphasizing empathy in passenger interactions and adding oversight when internal reports had potential for external amplification. As the year turned, Beacon published a short paper on institutional resilience, a practical manual co-authored with digital security partners about how nonprofits could protect themselves from coordinated campaigns, how donors could require procurement transparency, and how communities could intervene to defend truth. The paper circulated among philanthropic networks and provoked more conversations than any single op-ed had. The final image, when the story settled into archive, was modest. Liana and Isla walked into a schoolyard where Beacon teachers held a reading circle. Liana sat on a folding chair and opened a book. The children clustered around, each with a small snack and attention raw enough to be disarming. Liana read aloud not to make a point, but because it was what she had always done. Let language do the work of repair. A woman in the audience, a former donor who had stopped funding during the crisis and then returned, stood afterward and thanked Liana for the careful way the organization had navigated its recovery. She spoke without pomp. "You saved something that matters," she said simply. Liana answered without fanfare. "We all did," she said. "It wasn't me alone. It was everyone who kept showing up." The work of rebuilding reputation is not a single event. It is an accumulation of ordinary things: steady programs, cleared facts, attentive governance, and a community willing to stand with truth. Beacon's revival was not theatrical. It was the unspectacular resumption of a mission. When Liana tucked Isla in that night, she thought about how a small, private humiliation had touched a larger system, and how, through method and solidarity, a truth had been wrested back from falsehood. She did not celebrate the punishment of others. She reflected on the lesson the whole episode had taught. Dignity must be actively preserved, not merely assumed. They had not only defended themselves,
They had helped change, in small ways, the way institutions accounted for the possibility that reputations could be manufactured and weaponized. Laws would be debated, policies would be rewritten, procurement checks would be strengthened. None of it would be absolute. None of it would end all cruelty. But the arc had bent toward accountability. Isla slept with her hand tucked under the pillow, like a child who knew she was safe enough to rest. Liana, in the dim right, closed her laptop and breathed. She had stood for a moment that refused spectacle and insisted on facts.
She had taught her daughter the shape of courage, not the loud triumph of revenge, but the patient accumulation of evidence, community, and repair. If there was one small thing Liana wanted public memory to hold, it was this: that people who are visibly different deserve protection that is institutional as well as personal. That a corporation's reach should not enable the diminution of a human being. And that the compassionate response of ordinary bystanders, people like Marcus who recorded, like Captain Harris who intervened, like Maya who investigated, like David who traced the trail, and like the alumni who rallied, could restore what a lie had attempted to steal. Beacon resumed its rhythm. Isla returned to her routines, the small indignities of adolescence softened by a community that had learned to be quieter, kinder, and more watchful. Liana returned to the work that had always defined her, recognizing that leadership meant both public strategy and private protection. If anyone asked what had changed, Liana would not offer a single line of victory. She would speak instead of policy changes, of a manual published to guide other nonprofits, of an ongoing inquiry that had exposed pay-to-amplify networks, and of a small girl who had been taught, in a crowded cabin, that someone might stand beside her. A year later, Beacon held a modest event to mark the program's relaunch. Children read aloud, alumni gave short speeches about the measure of worth a school could assign, and a grant was announced from a consortium determined to fund anti-disinformation measures for civic organizations. Liana watched Isla accept a certificate for volunteer hours, with a smile that was unguarded at last. The smear had started with a roll and a cruel joke. It had led through darker places, false reports, fabricated files, and the industrialization of outrage. Yet it had also revealed a different truth, that dignity can be defended when communities gather methodically and refuse to let lies stand unchallenged. At the close of the event, Liana took the microphone for a few quiet sentences. She did not rehearse a litany of grievances. She spoke instead about obligations, to the children whose futures be conserved, to the staff who had kept the mission alive, and to the small people, like Isla, who trusted adults to keep them safe. Protecting dignity is not glamorous work, she said. It is patient, it is often thankless, and it is necessary. If we learned anything, it is that the truth can outrun a lie when people choose evidence over spectacle. Later, as people filed out into the night, a few attendees lingered, offering thanks. A man who had once been a donor approached, and with a small nod, handed Liana an envelope. No statement, no demand, just support. She accepted it with the same modesty that had guided her through the storm. They had been humbled by the ordeal and strengthened by the solidarity that followed.
The final beats of the story were not the fall of villains, though consequences had happened. They were the rebuilding of trust, the reform of systems, and the steady work of restoring what had been damaged. As Liana and Isla walked home beneath streetlights, they did not speak about headlines. They talked instead about reading lists and a neighbor's new garden. It was ordinary, and in its ordinariness, restorative. If anyone later looked back at the episode and searched for a moral, it would likely be this: dignity must be defended by fact and community. Privacy is not a weakness, but a choice. And when power is used to wound, accountability must be methodical rather than vindictive. Liana had chosen that path because, in the end, the goal was not to humiliate an antagonist, but to repair a life and a mission. One last note: if this story moved you, consider sharing it and supporting organizations that protect vulnerable youth and defend civic truth. Stories matter, especially when they are told with evidence, care, and the courage to stand beside those who are most exposed.